Throughout history, countless kings were born, lived, and died. But none were as tragic as the boy born in Jerusalem whose body slowly rotted away as he grew. Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, the man the people called the Leper King, carved his place in history not just with his throne, but with his disease. He was born in Jerusalem in 1161. His father was Amalric, king of Jerusalem. Baldwin was the king's only son. On the day he was born, the palace rang with joy. The future king had arrived. But strange symptoms emerged in his body when he was still a child. His hands got cuts without feeling pain. His skin gradually began to change. Everyone knew he would sit on the throne, but no one could have guessed his body would be ravaged by what was seen as a trial from God. By his father's command, William of Tyre, the most respected historian and clergyman of the time, became his teacher. Baldwin was a quiet, intelligent, and curious boy until that day came. The day a secret that would completely change his life was revealed. One day, William was watching his students play. The children were playfully scratching each other, leaving small marks. But Baldwin's situation was different. While the other children cried out in pain, there wasn't the slightest reaction on Baldwin's face. He felt nothing even as blood flowed from his arm. William became worried. He immediately informed the boy's father. Doctors were called, prayers were said, and ointments were applied. But no one could explain this oddity. As Baldwin grew, so did the disease. By the time he turned 13, sores began to appear on his fingers. His skin thinned, and spots formed on his face. Eventually, his skin lost all sensation. The doctors were now certain Baldwin had leprosy. In that era, leprosy was considered worse than death. Society viewed the disease as God's wrath. Lepers were exiled from cities and sent to isolated villages. Even approaching them was forbidden. But this time, the patient was the son of a king. No one knew what to do. King Amalric tried to hide his son's condition. However, the sores on his face eventually became noticeable to everyone. The palace staff whispered, and priests called it a trial. Baldwin, though, was silent. He was aware of what was happening but never complained. The pain in his body only strengthened the will growing within him. Perhaps that is why history remembers him not for his disease, but for his courage. When his father Amalric died, Baldwin was only 13. Regents governed the country for a period due to his young age. The kingdom was in turmoil. Everyone thought the young king wouldn't live long. No one expected anything great from him. But Baldwin wanted to prove these assumptions wrong. The leprosy was advancing, and he had to cover his face. He wrapped his hands in bandages, wore gloves, and covered his face with a veil. No one dared to touch the king anymore. Yet, every morning he prayed and continued to attend to state affairs. Meanwhile, a new power was rising in the east, Saladin. The Ayyubids had advanced all the way to Jerusalem's borders. The kingdom was weak, the army exhausted. The regents were afraid to fight. Some even argued that making peace with Saladin was the better choice. But young Baldwin opposed this idea. When he turned 16, he took full control of the government. His disease was severe, but his will was still strong. And he made his first decision. He would fight for Jerusalem. Saladin entered the territory of Jerusalem with an army of 25,000 men. Baldwin had only 5,000 soldiers. Many commanders suggested retreating, but Baldwin said, "I was not afraid to fight my disease. I will not be afraid of Saladin either." He took the lead of his army. He mounted his horse and looked at his soldiers from beneath the veil covering his face. His face was covered in sores, but his eyes were shining. The battle began near Montcassard. The Crusaders were outnumbered, but their morale was high. Saladin had been caught while his army was fatigued, and history witnessed a miracle that day. The army of Jerusalem routed Saladin's forces. The rumor says he turned to his army at that moment and declared, "A true king is revealed on the battlefield." This victory instantly turned Baldwin into a legend. Now, everyone remembered him not just as the Leper King, but as the hero of Jerusalem. Baldwin was still young, but his body was already like that of an old man. Leprosy had silently spread throughout his entire body. First, sensation was lost in his hands. Small cuts went unnoticed, and wounds never healed. His fingertips would turn black, then slowly fall off. Leprosy was killing the nerves. Baldwin felt no pain, but this made the disease even more dangerous. One day, candle wax dripped onto his hand, and he didn't notice. His hand was burned, and his skin was blistered. He only looked at it. He couldn't feel that area anymore. His face also began to change. His skin faded, his lips cracked, and his eyelids wouldn't fully close. His face was covered with bandages, and he no longer looked in the mirror. The chronicles record that his face became unrecognizable. Even breathing became difficult. At night, he would wake up with coughing fits and spit blood. Bloodstains would be found on his pillow in the morning. Fear reigned in the palace. Since the transmission of the disease was unknown, servants kept their distance. His meals were pushed in through the door. No one would hand him anything. The loneliness was heavier than the disease itself. The smell of leprosy could not be hidden. Incense was burned, and his room was ventilated, but it was useless. When meeting visitors, he would cover his face and bow his head while speaking. Historian William of Tyre said of him, "His flesh was dropping off, his hands were falling apart, but his soul endured this decay with patience. In time, his voice grew weak, and his tongue was full of sores. He couldn't eat solid food, subsisting only on liquids. He couldn't even hold a spoon due to the wounds on his hands. But no matter what, he never gave up. After every faint, he would wake up and say the same sentence." Baldwin's body was slowly dissolving, but his soul, within that rotting body, still stood tall like a king. By 1183, the kingdom of Jerusalem was a shadow of its former self. The kingdom's borders had shrunk, and the people were weary from wars. But Saladin still had his eyes on the holy city. This time, his target was the mighty stone mass rising in the middle of the Jordan Desert, Carrick Castle. Carrick was one of the most strategic points of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Moreover, the castle was currently hosting a wedding. Princess Isabella of Jerusalem, King Baldwin's half-sister, was marrying Humphrey of Turin. The castle halls were decorated, knights had set aside their armor, and wine barrels were opened. But the wedding festivities were short-lived. Saladin, at that very moment, besieged Carrick with his army. Tens of thousands of soldiers surrounded the castle walls, and catapults were prepared for fire. The sound of wedding bells was replaced by the drums of siege. Screams rising from the castle mixed with the panic and fear inside. The bride's mother, Maria Komnena, had taken refuge in the inner keep with her children. But even she, in a panic, sent a messenger. "Tell the king, Saladin has besieged Carrick." In Jerusalem, King Baldwin IV was wrestling with death. Leprosy had gnawed at his body. His eyes were nearly blind, and his hands were unable to grasp. He couldn't walk and sometimes even struggled to breathe. But there was one thing that never extinguished within him: his faith in his throne and his people. His commanders, seeing the state of the king, tried to stop him. "Your Majesty," they said, "you can no longer lead the army. Let us go." Baldwin, in a weak but resolute voice, replied, "I am the King of Jerusalem. If Jerusalem is in danger, I will be there." They placed him on a litter. His body couldn't move, but there was an unextinguished fire in his eyes. The Crusader banners of Jerusalem were carried at the head of the litter, and he appeared once again at the front of the army. The Leper King, but still a leader. When Baldwin's army approached Carrick, Saladin received the news. The scouts shouted, "The king is coming!" Saladin knew what he was up against at that moment. His enemy was physically weak, but still a symbolic power. Legend has it that Saladin showed deep respect upon learning of Baldwin's condition. He withdrew the siege line and gave his army this command: "One does not wage war in front of a blind but brave king." Carrick was thus saved. Baldwin could not rise from his litter, but the people welcomed him as a hero. Saladin, by withdrawing his army, sent a message: "I will take Jerusalem, but not by war. I will take it when God's time has come." This event was the final encounter between the two great leaders, Saladin and King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem. On one side, a king whose body had decayed but whose spirit was unshaken. On the other, a warrior noble enough to show mercy even to his enemy. The Siege of Carrick entered the history of the Middle Ages not just as a military event, but as a symbol of honor, faith, and humanity. When Baldwin returned to Jerusalem, the disease had completely taken over his body. His eyelids were swollen, and his eyes were nearly sightless. His lips were cracked, and his mouth was full of sores. Speaking became difficult. His skin was so fragile and sunken that a light touch would cause bleeding. Most of his fingers were almost entirely gone. The remaining ones were misshapen and useless. Baldwin could no longer walk. He needed a specially prepared litter to sit on the throne. While his servants carried him, everyone was silent, for both the disease and the king's body were frightening. According to chronicles relayed by William of Tyre, the palace staff could no longer directly touch his body. Every meal, every drink was pushed from the side of the litter, given without contact. Baldwin's pale face, with the advancement of leprosy, had become almost unrecognizable. The corrosive effect of leprosy had impacted not only his body but also his ability to communicate. Speaking was difficult. His voice was weak, and his words were often muffled. Some days, he would remain silent for hours, only nodding to give a clear reaction. Loneliness was the hardest part of the disease. Most servants and advisors did not dare to approach his room. The few who remained by the king were mostly silent due to the fear of the disease. Some chronicles recount that even Baldwin's own mother and close relatives hesitated to hold his hand. Isolation dominated the final years of his life. Despite all this physical pain, Baldwin tried to carry out state affairs. Even though he could not stand due to the disease, he was carried to palace meetings on his litter, where he gave his orders, signed decisions, and oversaw the functioning of the state. The chronicles mention that during this period, he was almost constantly treated with medicinal herbs and ointments. Baldwin's body was now often bloody, pus-filled, and inflamed. The bed sheets had to be changed continuously. In his will, he requested that his nephew, Baldwin IV, succeed him to the throne. Due to his own illness, he had been unable to marry and had no children. This decision was critically important for the future of the kingdom. At the age of 24, after a life filled with years of suffering, Baldwin passed away. When he died, his body was nearly unrecognizable. Under the effects of leprosy, the image of a king who once stood tall was gone. The people gave him the title of the Holy King, because despite having leprosy, he had remained on the throne of Jerusalem for a long time. Historians interpret his death not just as a physical collapse, but also as a symbol of the stigma and isolation that leprosy created in Jerusalem. William of Tyre and the Ernul Chronicle summarize Baldwin's final days. Baldwin's body was completely ruined, but his loneliness and silent suffering were met with deep respect by the people. Because leprosy had fatally slowed him down, yet it had turned him into a holy figure in the eyes of the public. Baldwin's last days were a heavy portrait of physical decay, pain, and loneliness. No one could stand beside him for long. Yet, those who quietly witnessed it could see the extent of the disease and the tragedy with their own eyes. Leprosy had completely taken over Baldwin's body. But the chronicles state that his will was still present, and that will was still influential over people. The decay and deformation caused by leprosy changed the way he was remembered. He was now recorded in history not just as a king, but also as a human being who tried to live under the affliction of the disease. Historians write different things about him. Some praise his courage, while others describe his disease as a painful symbol. But everyone agrees on one point. Baldwin IV was a king whose body was weak but whose spirit was never defeated. Even Saladin respected him. When he saw a boy king with a face covered in sores standing opposite him on the battlefield, he said, "There is a true king." The story of Baldwin IV, in fact, speaks of the limits of human endurance. A body may rot, but faith, will, and a sense of justice never decay. He inscribed his name in history not as the Leper King, but as the last true defender of Jerusalem. Even today, historians repeat the same sentence about him. Baldwin's body collapsed, but his spirit stood firm.